right, it's 10 a.m. Let's get started. Let's see. Gotta check the audio. Test. Yep. Okay, working. All right. So let's begin. And we left off here at the respiratory air volumes and capacities. Okay. Um, good. So normal breathing, as we sit here and just all relaxed, quietly, passively breathing in and out, is called tidal volume. Okay? And that's TIDAL, like the tides. It just comes in and goes out passively. Okay? Tidal volume. All right. Now, from tidal volume, the amount of air that we can still take in with forced inspiration is the inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, and so I'm sitting here breathing normally in and out, and then I do a forced maximal breath. The amount of air I can bring in beyond tidal volume is the inspiratory reserve volume. Okay. Now, as I'm sitting here breathing in and out, there's a certain amount of air I can force out of my lungs, and that's the expiratory reserve volume. The amount of air I can force out of my lungs past tidal volume is the expiratory reserve volume. Okay? And so if you take these three numbers, the inspiratory reserve volume, that's the volume of air that can be inspired beyond tidal volume. You take the tidal volume, and then you add also the expiratory reserve volume. These three volumes together make up the vital capacity. And we can measure all three of these with a device called a spirometer. It measures the amount of air entering or exiting the mouth. That's how we would measure it. Um, and so you get these three numbers, you add them together, you get the vital capacity. All right, now there's a fourth volume we didn't talk about, which is the residual volume. And the residual volume is the volume of air in our lungs that we actually can't force out of our lungs. So yes, the residual volume is the volume of air that we can't force out of our lungs. There will always be a portion of air that has to remain there. That's the residual volume. All right. So our inspiratory capacity over here includes the inspiratory reserve volume and the tidal volume. The functional residual capacity, okay, is the expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume combined. We can calculate those numbers. And this is an important one here. Functional residual capacity. If you go on to, work in a respiratory unit or something like that, they'll talk about FRC or the functional residual capacity. And what we're actually talking about is this point here, which is the base of the tidal volume. All right, so they'll phrase questions to you all the time like from FRC, the amount of air that can be inspired, blah blah blah. Now, the total lung capacity includes all of these volumes. Okay? It's the vital capacity plus the expiratory reserve volume. Okay? The most commonly used measures are, of course, the volumes, the four volumes. We also frequently use the vital capacity and the total lung capacity. All right, so we talked about each of these. All right. So the total lung capacity for the average individual, average adult, is about 5,800 milliliters of air. Yes, we measure air in milliliters because we're measuring the volume of the air, and liters are a unit of volume. All right, so 5,800 milliliters is the total lung capacity. Now that includes the expiratory reserve volume of about 1,100 milliliters. Okay, and if you subtract that from the total lung capacity, you should get 4,700, just doing some quick math in my head, should get 4,700 milliliters, okay, for the vital capacity. 46, 47, whatever. All right. Yeah, good, good. Tidal volume's about 500 milliliters. So as we're sitting here breathing in and out passively, we will breathe in about 500 milliliters of air and then breathe out about 500 milliliters of air. So here is a couple of interesting concepts, and that's the dead space. You have the anatomic dead space and the physiologic dead space. We also have alveolar dead space. Now, the anatomic dead space is the air in the respiratory tract that remains in the conduction pathways and doesn't reach the alveoli. So, um, I'm breathing in. Just picture I breathe in 500 milliliters of air. All right. Now, in that 500 milliliters, some of it's going to enter the lungs or the respiratory pathways first, and then some will enter last. The last air to enter the respiratory pathway is going to wind up stuck in the trachea and the bronchi. Now, you remember the conduction pathways, which include the trachea, the bronchi, and most of the bronchioles. We can't actually do gas exchange there. We can't exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide across the wall with blood. Okay, and so for these anatomical reasons, we can't exchange air in the conducting pathways, and so we call this the anatomic dead space. All right, no gas exchange occurs here for anatomical reasons. There's also alveolar dead space, where the air in the respiratory tract reaches non-functional alveoli, and these are alveoli that are associated with capillaries with poor blood flow, or they might not have much in the way of capillaries at all. There might be poor vascularization of the alveolus. This occurs occasionally. Then we also have the physiologic dead space, which is the total anatomical and alveolar dead space. Remember, anatomy is structure and then physiology is function. So the anatomic dead space is the dead space where air, for anatomical reasons, can't cross the wall. And then the physiologic dead space includes the anatomical dead space and the alveolar dead space, where gas is reaching the alveoli, but they can't exchange well with the capillaries on the other side of the wall. So this is functionally all the dead space. So under normal circumstances, the anatomic dead space is the physiologic dead space. That is to say, under normal circumstances, all of the air that we are unable to, all of the air that reaches, how do we phrase this in a way that makes sense? Um, Under physiological conditions, under normal conditions, there is no alveolar dead space. Okay. Um, all right, so alveolar dead space plus anatomic dead space equals physiologic dead space, but under normal physiological conditions, the alveolar dead space is 0. Okay. Normally, the alveoli are richly vascularized. They have a lot of blood capillaries surrounding them. So alveolar ventilation, we look at the minute ventilation, or MRV, minute respiratory volume. So the volume of new air from outside the body, atmospheric air, that is moved into the respiratory passages each minute is the minute respiratory volume. So the MRV equals the tidal volume, that's the amount of air we breathe in a single passive breath. And then we multiply that by the respiratory rate, right? So how many breaths in a minute? All right, and if you're taking 22 breaths in a minute, 500 milliliters per, there's 22 breaths, multiplied by 500 milliliters per passive breath. That's 11 liters of air in a minute. All right, because 500 milliliters is half a liter, or you could say a liter is 1,000 milliliters. All right. The alveolar ventilation rate is what we calculate because not all of the air is going to reach the alveoli. Remember, some get stuck in the anatomical dead space. And so also the physiologic, but normally physiologic equals anatomic. Anyway, because not all of the air is going to reach functional alveoli, we can also calculate the alveolar ventilation rate, which is the amount of air that reaches the alveoli. And this is maybe a more useful number, although in a practical clinical setting, it would be the harder one to get. All right, so the alveolar ventilation rate, or AVR, is the tidal volume, 500 milliliters, minus the physiologic dead space, and then we multiply that by the breathing rate. Okay, and so the physiologic dead space, if I remember right, it's about 150 milliliters per breath. Okay, get our calculator back out. 500 is the tidal volume. Subtract the anatomical or physiological dead space, and we get 350 milliliters per breath. That's the amount of air, that's the volume of air that's actually reaching the alveoli, functional alveoli, each minute for the average person. We can go ahead and multiply that by, let's say, 22 breaths in a minute. That gives us 7,700 milliliters or 7.7 liters of air. All right. And if you remember, we calculated the MVR as 11 liters and the AVR as 7.7. So you can see that, again, not all of the air that we breathe in is reaching the alveoli. So non-respiratory movements, this is where we move air into or out of the lungs, typically out, so that we can accomplish a few things, clearing the air passages, coughing, sneezing. We can also express emotions, laugh and cry, and then I'm doing one of them right now, and that's talking. That's a non-respiratory movement. And many of these result from reflexes, but sometimes they can be started voluntarily. Of course, speech can be. It's actually interesting. In animals that don't communicate the way humans do, right, with speech, and most other animals, especially mammals, there are actually breathing reflexes that control the intercostal muscles and keep them rhythmic, keep them on a uh, sort of rhythmic repeating pattern of expanding and contracting, right? At least the ribs of expanding and contracting to keep us breathing. And as children, as we learn to talk, our brain actually overrides this reflex and it disappears in the older child. I say older, in the area of 1 to 2. All right, so we have a few of these here. All right, so respiratory disorders that decrease ventilation. You've got bronchial asthma and emphysema. Bronchial asthma is an allergic reaction to foreign antigens in the airway, such as pollen. In smaller airways, mucus and secretions from the allergic response are going to build up. All right. And because not many cells are ciliated, we can't clear it out as effectively in the lower bronchi. All right, so allergens and secretions are going to irritate the smooth muscle surrounding the bronchi, which leads to bronchoconstriction. That's a constriction of the bronchi and the bronchioles, which is going to decrease the lumen, decrease the diameter of the airways, and make it harder to get air through the conducting pathway. All right, this will result ultimately in wheezing, and difficulty breathing. Emphysema is a progressive degenerative disease where the alveolar walls are destroyed. Now the walls, let's see, can I draw on this? Is there a draw button up here? feel like this would work better if I could draw, but... All right, let's do paint. MS Paint, good old MS Paint. All right, and so here you have an alveolar cluster, okay, or you could call it an alveolar sac, okay? And here we have, okay, walls separating them. And I'm going to draw in red here to show the surface area. So you can see the surface area of the alveoli. Of course, surface area is important because we exchange gases across the alveolar wall, right? So surface area is important. And this is a normal normal alveolar sac, okay? And then here we have emphysema. All right, and so the walls that separate the alveoli are destroyed, okay? The walls are destroyed, the alveoli will fuse to form larger alveoli, and you would think, right, that you could exchange more gas in larger alveoli, and that's actually not true. All of this space in the center, okay, there's going to be gas in here that's not in contact with a wall, and if it's not in contact with a wall, how is it going to be exchanged across the wall? Okay. Uh, yeah, so surface area is really important in the alveoli. More surface area means more gas exchange. Emphysema is a condition where, again, the walls between the alveoli break down and the alveoli will fuse. Sorry, it's hard to write, draw, and talk at the same time. All right. That was a terrible picture, but I hope it helps demonstrate the idea. All right, so the control of breathing is rhythmic, and it's an involuntary act that continues when a person is unconscious. So it does come in a sort of rhythmic repeating pattern. I may not have been clear earlier. We overcome one of the reflexes, but not all of them. All right, so it occurs even when a person is unconscious. So when you're asleep, you will continue to breathe. And by the way, I'm not saying go buy one, but if you have one of the newer Fitbits, the Ionic, the Versa 2, and I think Charge 3, they've got this oxygen saturation monitor, which is pretty cool. It can actually tell you when your blood oxygen is low in the night. I mean, it's not going to wake you up, but you can check it the next day. All right. To monitor your sleep. A lot of cool features there. Anyway, the respiratory areas are in the pons and the medulla mainly. Okay. And so these are groups of neurons in the brain stem, mainly the pons and medulla, that initiate impulses that travel on cranial and spinal nerves, and they're responsible for causing the contractions that lead to inspiration and expiration, although expiration is mainly passive. Mainly. Normal expiration is passive. All right, so the respiratory areas also adjust the rate and the depth of breathing, so we will take faster or deeper breaths to compensate for whatever stimuli these regions are receiving. The main respiratory areas are the medullary respiratory center, found in the medulla, and you've got a ventral and a dorsal respiratory group seen here, ventral, dorsal. And then you have the pontine respiratory group found up in the pons. All right, so the pontine respiratory group is responsible for kind of monitoring and modifying the activity of the medullary respiratory center. Okay. So the ventral respiratory group is responsible for maintaining the rhythm of breathing, and the dorsal respiratory group is responsible for changes in the rate and the depth of breathing. Now, here's a fun concept: partial pressures, right? And so, what is atmospheric air pressure? You remember? Well, actually, it's right here, 760 millimeters mercury. Okay. Now, what is the air pressure of just oxygen in the atmosphere, right? How do we figure that out? Well, air, the atmospheric air, is 21% oxygen. Okay. And if the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters mercury, we can go ahead and do the math on that. So we convert 21% to a decimal. Of course, you know that 21% converted to a decimal is 0.21. We multiply that by atmospheric air pressure, which is 760 millimeters mercury, and we find that the partial pressure of oxygen is 159.6 or 160. They rounded it up, 160 millimeters mercury. Okay. This is PO2. We mark that as PO2, the partial pressure of oxygen. Okay. So partial pressure, what is the concept of partial pressure? Each gas in a gas mixture contributes to the total pressure, right? All right, and the pressure of each gas in the total mixture is proportional to its concentration in the mixture. So again, 21% of atmospheric air is oxygen. So 21% of the atmospheric pressure is due to oxygen. Okay, so we can calculate that. 0.21 times 760 gave us 159.6 millimeters mercury, which we write as PO2. Now, the partial pressures are a method for referring to the relative amounts of gases in a mixture instead of using their concentrations. There are good reasons to not specifically talk about concentrations in gases, but we won't be getting into that in here because it's more physiochemical. All right, so a number of factors affect the rate and the depth of breathing. So you've got the partial pressure of oxygen and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. You also have the degree of stretch in the lung tissue. We do have mechanoreceptors in the lung and in the chest wall detecting stretch. You also have emotional state. All right, and so if you're angry, you may be breathing more quickly. If you're just generally depressed, you may be breathing more slowly. Long, deep breaths are characteristic of depression. As well as your level of physical activity, of course. As we exercise, we are going to increase our rate of breathing in order to bring more air, more oxygen in, and get more CO2 out. So there are receptors involved, which include the mechanoreceptors I mentioned, as well as central and peripheral chemoreceptors. Now, these chemoreceptors are going to be detecting the presence of oxygen or hydrogen ions. Okay, and so do you remember we talked about carbonic acid before? And so H2O plus CO2 gives us H2CO3, carbonic acid. Okay. And so, let's see, do we have a picture of it? The central chemoreceptors. We don't. We don't. But here's a picture of the brain. All right. The central chemoreceptors are located in the brain, and CO2 is it's able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Okay, it does cross the blood-brain barrier, and it gets to the other side. Now, hydrogen ions are not. So what's interesting here is that the central chemoreceptors actually detect hydrogen ion concentration. So how are they going to detect the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood if hydrogen ions can't cross the blood-brain barrier? Well, what happens is that I told you about carbonic acid, H2CO3. We lose a hydrogen ion off of that, and it becomes bicarbonate. Now, bicarbonate's traveling through the bloodstream. It gets to the brain. It accepts a hydrogen back and becomes carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid can actually go through the same reaction it went through earlier in reverse. It can revert back to CO2 and H2O. Now, here, CO2 is able to cross the blood-brain barrier. And so CO2 crosses into the brain and it does the whole chemical reaction back over. It converts into carbonic acid and then it releases a hydrogen ion. And now we have hydrogen ions in the brain proportional to the amount of hydrogen ions in the blood. All right, by joining bicarbonate, becoming carbonic acid, then dissociating to make CO2, CO2 crosses, and then again becomes carbonic acid and releases a hydrogen ion. Now the central receptors, central chemoreceptors, are able to detect the hydrogen ion concentration of the blood. And so if the blood is too acidic, that indicates that there's probably too much carbon dioxide in the blood. Too many hydrogen ions means too acidic. Too acidic means probably too many carbon dioxide molecules in the blood. When these central chemoreceptors are stimulated by the hydrogen ions, that will initiate a reflex that increases the respiratory rate so that we can breathe out, or many people would say blow off, CO2 more quickly. All right, did I miss any of that here? Nope. So they're monitoring pH in the brain. Of course, they do that by measuring the hydrogen ion concentration. All right. Hold on. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Now, the peripheral chemoreceptors are located in the carotid bodies, and the carotid bodies are a cluster of chemoreceptors just outside the carotid sinus. Do you see this kind of swelling here where the internal and the external jugular split? Okay. This is the carotid sinus, and then the carotid bodies are located right next to that. And they mainly sense changes in blood oxygen. Okay. There are also aortic bodies, but the most active ones are the carotid bodies. And they're going to increase the breathing rate and the tidal volume to bring in more air and get more oxygen in. So it usually does not cause a major response until the PO2, that's the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, decreases to about 50% of its normal volume. All right, and so the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood has to decrease by 50% before the carotid bodies will kick into action. Really, respiration, at least by the by the peripheral and the chemoreceptors, it's mainly driven by the central chemoreceptors. Their detection of CO2 through that really long pathway we just talked about, their detection of CO2 levels drives respiration for the most part. Oxygen can play a role through the carotid bodies, but it's mainly driven by CO2, hydrogen ion concentration, and the central chemoreceptors. So the inflation or Herring-Breuer reflex helps regulate the depth of breathing. And so as lung tissues stretch during inspiration, stretch receptors are also stimulated. We have stretch receptors in the lung, also in the thoracic wall. All right. And so sensory impulses which detect or which carry information about the degree of stretch will be carried over the vagus nerve to the respiratory areas in the medulla and the pons. So during the duration of inspiratory bursts is going to be shortened then. So if we're overstretching the lung, if we're overstretching the chest wall, we will shorten the duration of our breaths. All right, this prevents overinflation of the lungs during forced breathing. All right. So exercise and breathing. Exercise can greatly increase the amount of oxygen used each minute, right? We're going to need to power muscle. Muscle is expensive. We're going to immediately start breaking down sugars. Over the course of minutes, we will eventually start breaking down fats. And, a lot of people phrase that idea as like the body wants to hold on to fat, and that's kind of true, but also just biochemically, it takes longer to break down fats. So when you first start exercise, you're going to break down sugars. Anyway, breaking down both of them is going to release CO2. All right, and so we need to increase our breathing rate to get one, more oxygen so that we can break down more sugars and fats for energy. And two, we need to get rid of the CO2 we produced when we broke down sugars and fats for energy. All right. So during exercise, increased breathing rates would be expected to result from a decrease in blood oxygen and an increase in blood CO2. But that's actually not the case with exercise. The breathing rate does increase, but it's not driven by changes in levels of oxygen and CO2. They don't change significantly. The body is actually proactive about this. All right. So the increased breathing rate during exercise comes from the cerebral cortex. So of course you remember that the primary motor cortex is in the frontal lobe. It's in the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex. And whenever we initiate a movement, whenever we initiate, step forward, step forward, step forward, or several rapid steps forward, right, that turn into running, in addition to sending that message out, the primary motor cortex will also send a message to the respiratory centers to speed up the rate at which we breathe. So at the same time we're sending the signal to move the legs, we are already sending a signal to the respiratory centers to speed up. All right. We also have proprioceptors. These are mechanoreceptors in the muscles and tendons. They're stimulated by the muscular movements. Okay, and so they will in turn stimulate the respiratory centers in the medulla and the pons to increase the breathing rate. And this is called the joint reflex. All right. So, like I said, the body is proactive about this. The body knows it's starting exercise, and it's going to, when it first sends the signal from the cerebrum, tell the respiratory centers to speed up. And when movement is detected in the muscles and tendons, we will send a message through the joint reflex to the respiratory centers to tell them to speed up the rate of breathing. All right, and so by doing this proactively, by increasing our breathing rate before we have an oxygen debt, the levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood are relatively unchanged. All right, so exercise increases the demands on both the respiratory and the cardiovascular systems, but both systems have to keep up with the demands. If the shortness of breath occurs, it's typically due to the cardiovascular system not moving enough blood between the lungs and the body cells. We get, by increasing the breathing rate, plenty of oxygen. Uh, the heart is not pumping blood fast enough, efficiently enough out to the tissues. All right, so cardiovascular conditioning has many health benefits for athletes of all sports. All right, so tube-like organs of the respiratory system transport air into and out of the lungs. Those are the bronchi, the bronchioles, the trachea. The alveoli are those grape-like sacs at the end where we undergo the vital process of gas exchange between the air and the blood. And so if we look here, we can see the alveoli, all right, which are at the ends of the alveolar ducts, and they permit air to pass from one alveolus to another sometimes. You can see right here is an opening between this alveolus and the next. Okay, and because we have these small holes in the wall, this allows air to move between the alveoli. So if you had one alveolus that was non-functional, for instance, air would be able to move from it into adjacent alveoli. If you had one that was collapsed, they do collapse sometimes, air would be able to move from it into the next over. All right. So I'm going to take a break real quick. Do we have any questions so far? All right, no questions, so we'll keep moving, I guess. I'll look back up. Um, just remember, you can ask questions anytime. All right, so most of the wall of an alveolus consists of a layer of, we mentioned, simple squamous epithelium. These are the type 1 alveolar cells. Part of the wall of an alveolus, though, is also made up of type 2 alveolar cells, and they secrete pulmonary surfactant. So we mentioned there were two forces at work in the expansion and the contraction of the alveoli. Of course, well, I mean, there's obviously the pressure in air, but and in the thorax due to volume. But within the alveolus, you've got surface tension. There's a layer of water on the cells, and water molecules are attracted to one another. And this creates surface tension, which is going to pull the water molecules together and pull the alveoli shut. Okay. Now, counteracting this is surfactant. Surfactant is a chemical that is going to be released into this layer of water that helps break up the hydrogen bonds that hold together water. And so it will reduce surface tension. All right. And so surface tension, surfactant, when it reduces surface tension, helps the alveoli open. If you have too much surface tension, it will be difficult for the alveoli to open. Okay? And when you have too little surfactant, you'll have too much surface tension, which will pull the alveoli closed. All right, so gas exchange between the alveolar air and the blood occurs through the respiratory membrane. And we've talked about the respiratory membrane briefly, but basically you've got the alveolar wall, the wall of the alveolus, made up of simple squamous epithelium. You have the wall of the blood capillary, which is made up of simple squamous epithelium also. And then between them, you have two basement membranes, one for the blood capillary wall, one for the alveolar wall. And these are thin layers between the alveolus and the capillary. So 4 layers, you've got two basement membranes, the blood capillary wall and the alveolar wall. Now, the basement membranes are thin, as are the simple squamous epithelium in the alveolar and the blood capillary wall. So as far as barriers to the outside world go, this is really thin. Okay. And so here you can see a cross section of the capillary. Inside of it are red blood cells. These red blood cells are full of hemoglobin, which is bound to carbon dioxide. Okay, carbon dioxide is bound to the hemoglobin, we should say. Now, when we get to this area where the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is relatively low because we've been transferring it to the alveolus, Carbon dioxide will dissociate from the hemoglobin, or in other words, let go of the hemoglobin, and then move into the blood, and from the blood into the alveolus, where the pressure for carbon dioxide is even lower. All right, so the blood is released from the hemoglobin. I'm sorry, the carbon dioxide is released from the hemoglobin into the blood plasma, and then from the blood plasma across the respiratory membrane into the alveolus, where the pressure for carbon dioxide is even lower. On the other hand, we have oxygen also here in the alveolus, and the oxygen here is at a higher concentration than it is in the blood. And so it will diffuse across the respiratory membrane into the blood. And so oxygen actually can't, there's a limit to the amount of oxygen we can hold dissolved in the blood. And it's not a very high limit. It's not much. And so in order to take on all the oxygen that we need to keep the body's cells and tissues going, oxygen then binds to hemoglobin in the red blood cell. Okay. So in the lungs, hemoglobin gives off CO2, which diffuses into the blood and then from there into the alveolus. Oxygen, on the other hand, in the alveolus diffuses across the respiratory membrane into the blood and then binds to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is important because it allows us to hold on to a lot more oxygen than we could if we expected it to just stay dissolved in the blood. Again, there's a limit to how much we can keep dissolved in the blood, and it's fairly low. All right. So here you can see we've got the basement membrane here. Okay. Basement membrane, and then we've got the alveolus, the alveolar wall up here. Okay, then you got the red blood cells traveling through the capillary. Okay. Uh, it's not a big barrier between the capillary and the alveolus. The respiratory membrane is not a significant barrier. All right. So molecules, of course, we know are going to diffuse from areas of higher concentration toward areas of lower concentration. All right. So to determine the direction of diffusion for a substance, you have to know the concentration gradient. And as we've said, just remember, oxygen concentration is highest in atmospheric air. There's no source for oxygen inside the body, and so it's always going to be highest in atmospheric air. We bring atmospheric air down into the alveoli, and then oxygen in that air, the alveolar air, is going to diffuse across the respiratory membrane into the blood. Carbon dioxide, there is not a significant source for carbon dioxide outside the body. I mean, humans are, pumping out tons of it with our cars and planes and, giant agriculture operations. But um, still, the partial pressure for for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is relatively low compared to oxygen. And so, as far as we're concerned, humans are the source for CO2, animals too, right? So inside of us, our cells, our tissues, that's the source of CO2, at least as far as our body's concerned. And it's going to be at highest concentration in the tissues, okay, because they're the source of the carbon dioxide. Alveolar air is going to be relatively low, as will blood be relatively low in carbon dioxide. And so the gradient for O2 then is to diffuse from alveolar air into the blood and then into the tissues. And the concentration gradient for CO2 is to diffuse from the tissues into the blood and then into the alveolar air where it's even lower. All right, so here we can put some numbers to it. Here we have a blood capillary at the arterial end coming from the right side of the heart. All right, the partial pressure for CO2 is 45 millimeters mercury. Okay. Now, in the alveolus, the partial pressure for CO2 is 40 millimeters mercury. Now, why is it so close if atmospheric air is low in carbon dioxide? And that's, of course, this is a constant process. We're constantly diffusing CO2 into the alveolus. All right, and so CO2 in the alveolus will be close to the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, but the blood will be higher for carbon dioxide. And if it's higher in the blood, 45 compared to 40, of course we know that CO2 will diffuse into the area where the partial pressure is lower for carbon dioxide. Now take oxygen. Okay, the partial pressure for oxygen is 104 millimeters mercury. Why? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. It's 104 millimeters mercury. Okay, it's 40 millimeters mercury at the arterial end of the capillary, and so of course oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood. Okay, oxygen is of course going to diffuse into the blood. It's at much higher concentration in the in the alveolus than it is in the capillary, so it'll quickly diffuse over into the capillary. Now, as we pass through, we've spent more time exchanging gases across the respiratory membrane. All right, we reach the venous end of the capillaries, and now what's the concentration, the partial pressure, sorry, for each of these gases? Well, CO2 has gone from 45 down to 40 millimeters mercury. Okay? At the venous end, CO2 will resemble alveolar CO2. At the venous end, the partial pressure of oxygen is 104 millimeters mercury, and so at the venous end, the partial pressure of oxygen will resemble alveolar oxygen partial pressure. Okay? Another way to think about this is that we are going to see diffusion occur until we see equilibration. That is to say, we are going to see CO2 diffusing until it is equal with the other side. Okay, and so at the venous end, after we've had some time for diffusion to take place, the partial pressure of CO2 will be 40 millimeters mercury, same as in the alveolus, and same with PO2, partial pressure of oxygen will be the same as in the alveolus, 104 millimeters mercury. Now, interesting question. We calculated earlier, what was it, 159.6? Was that it? 0.21 times 760. Yes, we calculated 159.6 was the partial pressure of oxygen in atmospheric air. Why has it decreased in the alveoli? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that we added an extra gas when we breathed it in. You remember that we breathed in oxygen through the nose, we swirled it around the mucous membranes, and we picked up water. And so there's a new gas added to the mixture, and that's water vapor. And so by adding another gas without changing the total pressure, okay, it's still about 760 millimeters mercury total for all the gases in the lung. We've got to make some space, and so the partial pressure of oxygen drops. Okay. All right. So the effects of high altitude. So at high altitude, air is 21% oxygen, but the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, and that's because the pressure, total air pressure, decreases. Let's figure out what is atmospheric air pressure in Denver. Let's find this number. Okay, let's just go ahead and do it this way. elevation, Denver, Colorado. Oh my goodness. This is why nobody uses Bing. I've defended it for years, but elevation in Denver. Denver Wikipedia. It's gotta say. It's gotta be over here in the facts somewhere. Founded country, area, land, water, elevation. 5130 to 5690. Let's go ahead and say whatever, 5200 feet. 5,000 feet, whatever. This is embarrassing. Should have looked this up before. Of course, it's going to be in metric. All right. Here we go. It's going to be in metric. Yeah. Convert 5200 feet to meters. 1584. Goodness. Okay. So here we go. 1584 is going to be somewhere in this area. Okay. This is going to give us about 85 kilopascals. 85 kilopascals to millimeters mercury. 637. Man, that took forever. Sorry. Okay. We should probably all be using the metric system anyway, but yeah. Okay. So 637 millimeters mercury is the air pressure at 5,200 feet, which is Denver. So you go up to Denver, Colorado, air pressure is going to be 637 millimeters mercury. Now, of course, you know that's 670 at sea level. All right. Now, the concentration of oxygen hasn't changed. The air in Denver is still 21% oxygen. So we multiply 21% by 638, which is our new atmospheric air pressure, and we see that the partial pressure of oxygen has dropped from 159.6 to 133.98. Okay? That was a long way to go for that. Sorry about that. I was hoping the numbers would just be ready for us. Whatever. So moving on. At high altitude, air is still 21% oxygen, we said, but the partial pressure decreases, and that's because the total air pressure decreases. So oxygen diffuses more slowly into the blood, and the hemoglobin saturation will decline. People experience various degrees of altitude sickness, and when we're talking about altitude sickness, we're probably not talking about Denver. We're probably talking about the Himalayas, and I would look that up right now, except that took forever. I'm not doing that again. All right, so the body will attempt to obtain more oxygen by increasing the heart and breathing rate, and we'll see an increased production of red blood cells and hemoglobin. Okay. If we increase the number of red blood cells carrying hemoglobin, we increase the amount of oxygen that our blood can hold. So high altitude pulmonary edema, or HAPE, H-A-P-E, is a severe form of altitude sickness. You'll see sudden severe headaches, nausea, vomiting, rapid heart and breathing rate, as well as cyanosis, which is where the skin turns blue due to a lack of oxygen. Hypoxia, which is low blood oxygen. Hypoxia vasoconstricts pulmonary blood vessels, which sends blood under high pressure through the pulmonary circuit. If we send blood under high pressure through the pulmonary circuit, we can send blood quickly through it, but it spends less time diffusing. It also raises capillary pressure, and Increased hydrostatic pressure, of course, is going to mean more filtration and then the accumulation of fluid, the accumulation of excess fluid in the lungs, which leads to edema and makes the lungs less efficient. All right, so disorders that impair gas exchange. You have pneumonia, which is an infection of the lungs, and then the alveoli will swell due to edema or accumulation of fluid. The alveoli become abnormally permeable and they bring fluids and white blood cells into the alveoli. This decreases the available surface area for gas exchange. If we're covering our surface area with fluids and white blood cells, there's less surface area for gas exchange. Tuberculosis is a condition that's interesting. It used to be responsible for many deaths worldwide. It's been almost eradicated from the U.S. Luckily, it's not super contagious. It's actually really hard to catch tuberculosis. You have to spend a lot of time with somebody who has the condition to get it. But what's interesting about it is that there are new super drug resistant strains, the new strains of the bacteria that cause tuberculosis, and they are resistant to just about every antibiotic. Anyway, so this is a bacterial lung infection where dense connective tissue forms tubercles around the infection sites. The immune system in the body, they're basically trying to wall off the infection site, and they do it pretty successfully. They just surround the infection site with connective tissue, and that stops it from spreading. But the lung tissue in the process is destroyed, and the respiratory membrane is going to thicken where the tubercles form, and this will reduce the surface area for gas exchange. Now, atelectasis is a collapsed lung, fancy science word for a collapsed lung. And here, the blood vessels will collapse along with the lung. So in the case of obstruction, where one of the conducting tubes, the bronchi or bronchioles, are blocked, the alveoli beyond the obstruction will collapse. Usually the functional regions can carry on enough gas exchange for the cells. So if you see collapse of a bronchiole that supplies a number of terminal bronchiole, respiratory bronchioles, and then alveolar sacs, anything beyond the blockage will collapse, but there's still functional regions of the lung that can carry on gas exchange. The acute respiratory distress syndrome is a form of atelectasis where the alveoli collapse, the blood vessels and airways will narrow, and then oxygen delivery will be severely impaired. All right, so gas transport. The blood transports oxygen and carbon dioxide between the lungs and the body cells. And as the gases enter the blood, they dissolve in the plasma or they chemically combine with other substances. So you've got oxygen and carbon dioxide, which both bind to hemoglobin. And then carbon dioxide, we mentioned, can combine with water to form carbonic acid. So two methods of oxygen transport in the blood. About 98% of the oxygen is carried attached to hemoglobin in the red blood cells. The other 2% is dissolved in the blood plasma because, again, there's a limit to the amount of oxygen we can dissolve in the blood plasma. All right. So oxygen loosely binds to the iron in the heme unit of each of the 4 hemoglobin subunits. Remember, hemoglobin has 4 subunits. There are 2 alpha and 2 beta subunits in adult hemoglobin. And each one has a heme group that contains iron that binds oxygen. All right. So the chemical bonds between oxygen and hemoglobin are relatively unstable, though, and there are factors which will increase the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. So if we see a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, hemoglobin will release oxygen. If we see an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, hemoglobin will release oxygen. If the blood becomes more acidic, hemoglobin will release oxygen. And if the blood becomes warmer, hemoglobin will release oxygen. All right, so released oxygen moves from the blood into the tissues, and about 75% of the oxygen remains bound to hemoglobin in the venous blood. And this ensures safe carbon dioxide levels and pH. All right, so we've been going for about an hour today. We're about to move into some graphs I'd like to spend some time talking about. So why don't we go ahead and end it here? I'll pause for about a minute to see if we have any questions. Please, guys, anything? And if not, we'll end it. All right, and so we don't have any questions, it looks like. Remember, you can email me anytime if you do have questions, although you can get a faster response during the live lectures, of course. So we'll go ahead and end it here. We'll pick this up again, finish the last couple of slides on Tuesday, and then move into, I don't have it memorized, but I think digestive's probably up next. I'm going to look here. Uh, oh, no, urinary? No, we'll probably do digestive. Let's check the syllabus real quick. That's good. I do think digestive's next. Yeah, okay, we got digestive, and then the week after that we'll have spring break. Yay, right? Followed by nutrition. And so we'll finish up respiratory next week. The digestive system's another important system, so that'll probably spill over into the week of nutrition. Nutrition's a short lecture, should only take us that Thursday, so we're fine. We've got a little extra time to work on this. All right, great. We will see you guys Tuesday. Have a good weekend. I'll put up the lab materials a little bit later today.